If you'd told me a month ago that I'd inherit a cabin in the middle of nowhere, Montana, I would have laughed. I mean, what kind of young journalist has time to play caretaker to some dusty old house? But there I was, staring at the crumpled letter in my hand, sitting in my tiny New York apartment, wondering how I ended up with the last thing I thought I wanted, my grandmother's cabin. I barely knew my grandmother, Elizabeth Carter. She was more of a name whispered at family gatherings, a ghost from my dad's past. My parents never talked much about her, and honestly, I didn't ask. I figured she was just another piece of family baggage no one wanted to unpack. Still, when I got the news of her passing, and the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another family chore. The drive to Montana was long and painfully quiet, the kind of quiet that gives you too much time to think. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the thick forest surrounding the property. The place looked exactly how I imagined. Old, weathered, and straight out of a horror movie. The roof sagged slightly, the windows were thick with grime, and a porch swing creaked in the breeze like it hadn't been touched in decades. Stepping inside, the air was stale, and the faint smell of wood and dust made me sneeze. The place was packed with old furniture, faded rugs, and shelves lined with books that looked ready to crumble. But it wasn't all bad. There was something oddly charming about it, like it was holding on to secrets it wasn't quite ready to share. I spent most of that first evening exploring. The kitchen was tiny, the bathroom even tinier, and the bedrooms upstairs had beds draped with white sheets like in those cheesy haunted house movies. But the living room, it was different. It felt alive. And right there, sitting on a small table near the fireplace, was the radio. It looked ancient, with big round dials and a polished wooden finish that had seen better days. The weird thing was, it was on, softly humming with static. I fiddled with the knobs, but no matter how much I turned them, the static didn't change. It was strange, sure, but I figured it was just one of those quirks old things have. Later that night, after eating the sad sandwich I'd packed for the trip, I sat on the couch with a blanket around me, trying to warm up. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses in on your ears until you hear things you're not sure are real. A creak here, a rustle there. And then, from across the room, the radio crackled a little louder. At first I ignored it, chalking it up to the old wiring in the house. But then the static shifted. It wasn't just white noise anymore. It was rhythm, like someone whispering just beyond reach. I froze, staring at the radio. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until I could almost make out the words. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, like the house was holding its breath along with me. I sat there, heart racing, staring at the radio like it might come alive. It didn't, but something about that moment stuck with me, a heavy knot in the pit of my stomach that wouldn't go away. I tried to brush it off, blaming exhaustion and an overactive imagination. I mean, who wouldn't feel a little jumpy alone in an old cabin at night? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, with sunlight streaming through the dusty windows, the cabin felt less intimidating. I went about unpacking my few things, determined to make the best of the situation. But as I dusted off the shelves and straightened up the living room, I found something tucked behind the radio. A stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to my dad, William Carter, in my grandmother's handwriting. I hesitated, fingers trembling as I untied the ribbon. The top letter had a date from years ago, long before I was born. The first line made my blood run cold. "William, I know what you did." That knot in my stomach, it twisted tighter. I couldn't stop staring at those words. "William, I know what you did." My dad wasn't exactly a saint, but this sounded more like the opening line of a murder mystery than a note between family members. I flipped to the next page, desperate for answers, but the rest of the letter wasn't much better. My grandmother's handwriting was shaky, her sentences fragmented, like she'd been trying to write through a storm in her head. She mentioned things I couldn't quite make sense of. The woods, the accident, and something about promises that should have stayed buried. My pulse quickened as I read on, but the more I tried to understand, the more questions I had. What promises? What accident? I wanted to stop reading, but my curiosity wouldn't let me. I shuffled through the rest of the letters, finding similar cryptic messages. It was like she'd been trying to warn him, or maybe me, about something. And then, in the very last letter, she wrote, "The radio will tell you the rest, Emma, but you have to listen." My blood turned to ice. That night, the cabin felt different. The warmth of the sunlight was gone, replaced by the kind of chill that seeps into your bones no matter how many blankets you pile on. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread as I sat in the living room, staring at the radio like it was a ticking time bomb. I told myself it was ridiculous. Radios didn't tell stories. They didn't know anything. But as the hours dragged on, I found myself drawn to it. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the cabin cloaked in shadows, the static returned. This time, it wasn't a gentle hum. It was loud, aggressive, like it was fighting to be heard. My hand hovered over the dial, my heart hammering in my chest as I debated turning it off. But before I could decide, the static shifted again. A voice. It wasn't clear, more like fragments of words breaking through the noise, but it was there. It sounded distant, echoey, and eerily familiar. "Emma, you need to remember." I froze. My name, it said my name. I wanted to run, to get in my car and never look back, but my legs wouldn't move. The voice continued, cutting through the static in short, broken sentences. "The accident. Not what you think." It was like someone had dropped a boulder onto my chest. The accident, the one that killed my parents, the one I'd spent years trying to forget. I'd always been told it was just that, an accident, a patch of black ice, a twist of fate. But now, I leaned closer to the radio, my breath shaky. He lied. "Emma, it wasn't for you." "For me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. And just like that, the static cut off. Silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I sat there staring at the radio, waiting for something. Anything, but nothing happened. Sleep was out of the question after that. I stayed up all night, pacing the cabin, replaying the voice over and over in my head. It felt like my memories were betraying me. Had my whole life been built on a lie? By the time morning came, I was running on fumes. The cabin, bathed in daylight, looked less menacing, but it couldn't chase away the storm brewing in my mind. I decided to go back to town. Maybe Thomas, the old man from the store, could shed some light on my grandmother's letters, or the radio. The drive was short but felt endless. When I walked into the store, Thomas was behind the counter, sipping a steaming cup of coffee. He looked up at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Morning," he said slowly, setting his cup down. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated, unsure how much to say. "Thomas, what do you know about my grandmother's cabin?" His expression darkened, the lines on his weathered face deepening. "Plenty," he said after a long pause. "But it's not the kind of thing folks like to talk about." "Well, I need to know," I pressed. "What happened there?" Thomas sighed, leaning on the counter like he was carrying the weight of the world. "Your grandmother wasn't the first to own that place, you know. The Carters have had ties to those woods for generations, but bad things, they've always followed that family. There are stories, old stories about rituals, sacrifices, things no one likes to admit really happened." "Rituals," my stomach turned. Thomas nodded grimly. "Your dad, William, he wasn't exactly a stranger to that kind of thing. Some say he got mixed up in it before you were born. Others say he never stopped." The air seemed to thicken around me, my head spinning with the weight of his words. "What kind of rituals?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Thomas didn't answer right away. Instead, he fixed me with a look so serious it made my skin crawl. "Let's just say those woods have seen things no one should see. And that radio of yours? It's not just a piece of junk. It's connected to something. Something old." I left the store in a daze, Thomas's words echoing in my mind. Rituals. Sacrifices. My dad. It was too much, too fast. But one thing was clear. The voice on the radio wasn't done with me. Driving back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the knot twisting tighter in my stomach. Thomas's words kept circling in my head. Rituals, sacrifices, something old. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than my grandmother, bigger than the cabin. And now it was pulling me straight into its web. The radio greeted me with static the moment I stepped through the door, as if it had been waiting. I hesitated, my fingers brushing against the cold surface of the dial. Every instinct screamed for me to walk away, to pack my things and leave this cursed place. But I couldn't. I needed answers. And the radio was the only thing giving them to me, even if they came in fragments that threatened to tear apart everything I thought I knew. "All right," I whispered to the empty room. "What do you want me to know?" The static surged, louder than before, crackling like a storm was brewing inside the tiny box. And then the voice returned, clear and sharp this time. "Emma, remember." The room felt colder, like all the heat had been sucked out. The fireplace, which had been burning steadily, flickered and dimmed. I grabbed the letters from the table and clutched them tightly, like they might anchor me to reality. "What do I need to remember?" I demanded, my voice trembling but firm. The radio sputtered, the words coming faster now, spilling out like a flood. Your father. He lied. He did it. For you. For me? My voice cracked, tears welling up in my eyes. What did he do? The static roared, filling the room with a deafening hum, and suddenly I was no longer standing in the cabin. The walls around me dissolved into darkness, and in their place, a memory began to unfold. I was in the back seat of my family's car. The headlights barely pierced through the snowstorm raging outside. My dad's voice, tense and urgent, echoed in my ears. It's the only way, he muttered, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. My mom, sitting in the passenger seat, turned to him, her face pale with fear. William, please, there has to be another way. She's just a child. Their words twisted in my mind, overlapping with the voice from the radio. He lied. For you. I could feel the car skidding, the tires losing grip on the icy road. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut. The screaming, the crunch of metal, the unbearable silence that followed. I'd always believed the crash was an accident, a cruel twist of fate, but now I saw it for what it was. My father hadn't lost control of the car. He'd driven us off the road deliberately. The darkness around me shifted, and I was back in the cabin, gasping for air. The radio was still humming, but now it seemed quieter, like it was waiting for me to catch up. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the letters. You killed her, I whispered, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. No. The voice came through the radio again, low and mournful. He did. For you. I sat down hard, the weight of everything crashing down on me. My father had sacrificed my mother. For me. The letters made sense now. The rituals, the warnings, the guilt that had seeped through every word my grandmother had written. My survival hadn't been a miracle. It had been bought. The static returned, louder and angrier than before. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, something tangible, filling the room with a suffocating energy. The walls seemed to tremble, the shadows growing darker and deeper. And then I saw her. My mother's figure emerged from the corner of the room, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She looked exactly as I remembered, but there was something off, something wrong. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me, at the radio. Mom? My voice cracked. Her gaze shifted, and for a moment her expression softened. She raised a hand, pointing at the radio. You have to stop it, she said, her voice echoing like it was coming from a great distance. End this, Emma. It's the only way. The radio's static grew louder, almost like it was fighting her words. The shadows in the room writhed, creeping closer, and I could feel the weight of whatever was tied to this place pressing down on me. What happens if I don't? I asked, tears streaming down my face. Her answer was simple, but it cut through me like a knife. You'll never leave. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I had to try. I grabbed the radio with both hands, the wood cold and slick under my fingers, and yanked the cord from the wall. For a moment, the static stopped, but then it roared back to life, louder than ever, and I felt the air around me shift. The cabin groaned, the floorboards buckling beneath me. My mother's figure began to fade, her outline dissolving like smoke. Emma, she said one last time, you can end this. Be brave. The shadows surged forward and I screamed as the radio began to crackle again. This time the voice wasn't hers. It wasn't anyone I recognized. Stay with us, it whispered low and guttural. Stay forever. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I grabbed the radio and hurled it into the fireplace. Flames engulfed it, and the static turned into an ear-piercing screech. The cabin shook violently, and for a moment, I thought it was going to collapse. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. The radio was gone, reduced to ash, and the cabin was silent. Too silent. But I wasn't safe yet. The silence was unbearable. It wrapped around me like a heavy, wet blanket, suffocating and oppressive. The radio was gone, reduced to a pile of smoldering ash in the fireplace, but the weight in the air hadn't lifted. If anything, it felt heavier, thicker, like whatever had been bound to the radio was now unleashed, free to roam the cabin. I stumbled back from the fireplace, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The cabin was still, but something was wrong. The shadows, which had seemed to retreat when the radio burned, began creeping across the walls again, like ink spreading in water. A cold wind swept through the room, though the windows were shut tight, and then I heard it. Whispers. They weren't coming from the radio this time. They were all around me, a chorus of voices murmuring just out of reach. You can't escape. Stay with us. Forever. I clutched my arms, trying to steady my breathing, but the whispers only grew louder. filling every corner of the room. My legs felt like jelly as I turned to the fireplace, where the ashes of the radio glowed faintly. The shadows pulsed toward it, as if drawn to the dying embers. "Emma," her voice. My mother's voice cut through the cacophony, clear and urgent. I spun around, and there she was again, standing at the edge of the room, her form flickering like a candle in the wind, her eyes locked onto mine, full of pain, but also something else, determination. "You have to finish it," she said, her voice trembling. "The house, the past, it's all connected. It won't let go until you let it." "What does that mean?" I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "How do I let it go?" She stepped closer, her figure growing more solid, more real. "It's not just the radio, Emma. This house, this land, it's been feeding on us for generations, on the lies, the guilt, the sacrifices. It's time to end it." "But how?" My voice broke. "I don't know what to do." The cabin groaned, the walls trembling as if they were alive. The shadows surged again, swallowing the light from the fireplace. My mother reached out, her hand hovering inches from mine. "Burn it," she said, her voice steady now. "All of it. The house, the letters, everything. It's the only way to break the cycle." I froze, the weight of her words sinking in. Burn it. Destroy the only thing left of my family's legacy. Could I really do it? But then the whispers returned, sharper, angrier, as if they could sense my hesitation. The shadows crept closer, their edges flickering like flames, and I knew I didn't have a choice. "I'll do it," I whispered, more to myself than to her. She smiled faintly, her form already beginning to fade. "Be brave, Emma. I'll be waiting." The shadows lunged as she disappeared, and I bolted. My heart was pounding as I ran to the kitchen, throwing open drawers and cabinets, searching for anything I could use to set the house ablaze. My hands landed on an old oil lamp, dusty but intact. I grabbed it and a box of matches, my fingers trembling as I worked. The cabin seemed to fight back. The floor buckled under my feet, the walls groaned and cracked, and the air itself felt heavy, like it was trying to hold me in place. But I didn't stop. I doused the living room in oil, splashing it over the walls, the furniture, the pile of letters still sitting on the table. The shadows screamed around me, twisting and writhing, but I struck the match anyway. The flame caught immediately, roaring to life as it devoured the oil-soaked wood. I stumbled back, watching as the fire spread, climbing the walls and engulfing everything in its path. The whispers turned into wails, deafening and desperate, but I didn't look away. The heat was overwhelming, sweat pouring down my face as the flames grew higher and higher. The shadows thrashed, their shapes disintegrating in the light of the fire. The house groaned one last time, a long, mournful sound, and then the ceiling began to cave in. I ran. The cold night air hit me like a punch as I burst through the front door, collapsing onto the grass outside. I turned just in time to see the cabin consumed by flames, the fire reaching up to the starless sky. The wails of the shadows faded, replaced by the crackling of burning wood and the distant call of night birds. For the first time since I arrived, the air felt light, clean. I sat there, staring at the blaze until it finally burned itself out. The cabin was gone, reduced to ashes, but I felt no sadness, just relief. And then I saw her, my mother, standing at the edge of the forest, her figure glowing softly in the moonlight. She smiled at me, a smile full of peace, and nodded once before fading into the trees. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the spot where she'd been. The dawn was breaking by the time I finally got to my feet, brushing the dirt from my jeans. It was over. At least I thought it was. As I walked back to my car, ready to leave this nightmare behind, I heard it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The crackle of static. It was supposed to be a simple drive. I'd done it a dozen times before, heading from Portland to my sister's house in Bridgeton for our usual family dinner. The weather had been perfect earlier in the day, and I'd even rolled the windows down for most of the trip. But as the sun dipped lower, the air grew colder, and that's when I first noticed the fog. It started as a light mist, barely noticeable, but within minutes it thickened into a dense wall that swallowed the road ahead. My headlights barely cut through it, and I could feel my chest tightening with every mile. The GPS had been acting weird for the past 10 minutes, showing me in the middle of a blank gray space instead of on the highway. I tapped the screen a few times, hoping it would snap out of it, but nothing changed. Recalculating, it droned for the 5th time before giving up entirely. Frustrated, I slowed the car, squinting at the road ahead. The fog clung to everything, muffling the world outside until it felt like I was driving through a dream or a nightmare. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, something darted across the road, a blur of motion, too fast for me to process. My instincts kicked in, and I swerved hard to avoid it. The tires screeched and the car spun, skidding off the asphalt and onto the shoulder. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me in silence except for my own ragged breathing. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, trying to convince myself that whatever I'd seen wasn't real. A deer, maybe, or a trick of the fog. But when I glanced back at the road, there was nothing there. The car wouldn't start again. I tried the ignition 3 times, but all it gave me was a dull click. My phone was next. No signal, of course. Perfect, I muttered, slamming the phone onto the passenger seat. I stepped out of the car, pulling my jacket tighter against the cold. The fog was everywhere now, wrapping around me like a damp blanket. I could barely see 10 feet ahead, but in the distance, I spotted something. A faint light flickering through the mist. It was coming from what looked like a small cluster of buildings, just off the road. A village? I didn't remember seeing anything like that on the map, but at this point I didn't care. I grabbed my phone and flashlight from the car and started walking toward the lights. My boots crunched on the gravel shoulder, the sound eerily loud in the stillness. As I got closer, the outlines of the village came into view. It wasn't large, maybe 10 or 12 buildings, all old and weathered, their paint peeling and windows clouded with grime. The streets were paved with cobblestones, slick with moisture from the fog. The first house I approached had a light on inside, its warm glow spilling through the cracks in the curtains. I knocked on the door, my fist echoing in the silence. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud, almost intrusive. No answer. I tried the next house and then the next. Same thing, lights on, but no one came to the door. That's when I saw them. Figures moving through the fog, their shapes barely visible. They looked human, but something about them was wrong. They were translucent, their edges blurry and indistinct, like I was seeing them through frosted glass. "Hey!" I called out, stepping toward one of them. It turned slightly, and for a brief moment, I thought it was looking at me. But then it stepped back into the fog, disappearing without a sound. A chill ran down my spine. Something about this place was deeply unsettling, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. As I turned to head back to my car, I heard it. My name. "Carolina?" The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it stopped me in my tracks. "Hello?" I called out, spinning around. The fog thickened, and the voice came again, closer this time. "Carolina, come here." It sounded familiar, like my mom's voice, but that didn't make sense. I stepped toward the sound, my heart pounding. "Mom, is that you?" The fog shifted, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing just ahead, reaching out to me, and then it was gone. The voice stayed with me, even after it stopped. It was my mother's voice, I was sure of it, but it didn't make sense. She was hours away, safe at home, probably setting the table for dinner and wondering why I was late. I stayed rooted in place, staring into the fog where the figure had been. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, clouding the air in front of me. Every instinct screamed at me to go back to the car, to lock the doors and wait for someone, anyone, to find me. But I couldn't. Something about this place, about the voice, was pulling me in. I moved deeper into the village, my footsteps echoing off the cobblestones. The houses were all the same, weathered, silent, and completely devoid of life. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows flitting through the fog, just out of reach. I called out once or twice, but no one answered. And then I saw the window. It was in one of the larger houses, its shutters slightly ajar. The faint glow of a lantern spilled out, illuminating the glass. Something was written there, scratched into the surface from the inside. "Don't trust them." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped closer, reaching out to touch the glass, but the fog around me seemed to shift, curling inward like it was alive. That's when I heard the voice again. "Carolina, come here." This time it wasn't my mother, it was my sister Elena. "Elena?" I called out, my voice cracking. The sound came from behind me, deeper in the fog. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. For a moment, I thought I saw her, a shape in the distance, just close enough to make out her long hair and the familiar way she tilted her head. I ran toward her, my heart pounding. "Elena, wait!" But as I got closer, the figure dissolved into the fog, leaving me alone on an empty street. "Stop playing games!" I shouted, my voice bouncing off the surrounding buildings. The fog shifted again, and suddenly I wasn't alone. They were all around me now. Those translucent figures I'd seen earlier. They stood in doorways, peered out of windows, and gathered at the edges of the street. Dozens of them, their faces blurry and indistinct, like smudged reflections in a dirty mirror. They didn't move or speak. They just watched. "What is this place?" I whispered, taking a step back. None of them answered. Instead, the fog thickened again, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I could barely see my hand in front of my face, and then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around, but there was no one there. The figures had disappeared and the street was empty again. My breathing was ragged, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening. I spotted a larger building at the end of the street, an old church, its steeple barely visible through the fog. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I don't know why I went in. Maybe I thought I'd find someone there, someone who could explain this nightmare. Or maybe I just needed to be somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't out in the open. The inside of the church was as eerie as the rest of the village. Pews sat empty, their wood warped and cracked with age. A single candle burned on the altar, its flame flickering weakly. And there, sitting on the altar, was a book. It was old, its leather cover cracked and worn, with no title on the spine. I approached it cautiously, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The book was open, its pages filled with neat, spidery handwriting. As I got closer, I realized the words were familiar. It was my name, my life. Everything about me was written there. The schools I'd attended, the trips I'd taken, even the fight I'd had with Elena last Thanksgiving. I flipped the page, my hands trembling. The entries continued, detailing my journey to this village, the fog, the voices. And then, the last page. Carolina will discover the truth. She will face the choice. "What choice?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The candle flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. I could feel the air pressing down on me, heavy and oppressive. From somewhere deep in the fog outside, I heard my name again. "Carolina, it's time." The voice echoed in my head, louder and more insistent this time. It wasn't my mother or my sister anymore. It was something else, something cold, hollow, and relentless. I clutched the book to my chest as I stumbled out of the church, the fog wrapping around me like it was alive. The village had changed. The streets were narrower, the buildings leaning inward, their windows dark and watching. The figures were back, but now they were closer. They stood in clusters, their indistinct faces turned toward me. I could feel their eyes, if they even had eyes, burning into me as I passed. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice breaking. They didn't move or respond. They just stared, their shapes flickering like dying flames. The book in my hands seemed to hum, its weight growing heavier with every step. I glanced down, unable to stop myself, and saw the words shifting on the page. "Carolina steps forward, closer to the truth. The figures close in, but she cannot turn back now." I slammed it shut, my breath hitching. "No," I whispered, "I'm not playing your game." But the village seemed to have other plans. The fog thickened, swirling around me until I could barely see my own feet. The ground beneath me felt uneven, like I was walking on something soft and unsteady. The voice returned, closer this time. "Carolina, it's time to choose." "Choose what?" I screamed into the mist, spinning in circles. "What do you want from me?" The fog parted suddenly, revealing a massive figure standing in the center of the street. It wasn't like the others. It was solid, towering over me, its form shrouded in dark, tattered robes that seemed to ripple and shift like smoke. Its face, or where a face should have been, was a void, an empty blackness that swallowed the light. "You are not supposed to be here," it said, its voice resonating like thunder. "I didn't ask to be here," I shot back, gripping the book tightly. "I just want to leave." The figure tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate. "There is no leaving," it said. "Not for you, not for anyone." The ground beneath me trembled and the fog swirled around the figure, its edges glowing faintly. "This place is a threshold," it continued. "A place between. You are here because you belong here." "I don't belong anywhere," I shouted, stepping back. "I didn't do anything wrong." The figure raised an arm and the fog around us froze, the air growing impossibly still. "Your actions brought you here, your choices, your fate." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I don't understand. What choices? What fate?" The book in my hands grew warmer, almost too hot to hold. The words on its cover began to glow, and I realized with a sickening certainty that it was waiting for me to open it. I didn't want to, but my hands moved on their own, flipping it open to the final page. "Carolina stands before the truth. She must choose to accept it or fight it, but the outcome will always be the same." My heart pounded as the figure loomed closer, its presence suffocating. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. It extended a hand, impossibly long fingers curling toward me. "Choose," it said simply. The book trembled in my hands, and the figures in the fog moved closer, forming a circle around us. Their voices rose in a haunting, dissonant hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I looked down at the book, then back at the figure. If I accepted this, whatever this was, would it end? Would I finally be free? But if I fought it, could I find a way out? A way back? The words in the book began to shift again, rewriting themselves faster than I could read. Carolina accepts her place in the village. She becomes part of the mist, a guide for others who wander here. Carolina fights the truth and fades into nothingness, erased from all existence. Neither choice felt like freedom. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. It just waited, its hand still outstretched. The fog closed in tighter, the figures pressing closer until I could feel the cold radiating from them. My head spun, my chest tightening as I realized there was no escape. Tears blurred my vision as I gripped the book tighter, my mind racing. If I helped them, if I stayed, maybe I could make a difference. Maybe I could stop others from ending up here. But would I even remember who I was? The fog seemed to breathe, and the figures began to hum louder, their voices blending into a single haunting melody. I closed my eyes, my heart pounding, and made my choice. I opened my eyes, the weight of my decision settling over me like the fog itself. The towering figure remained in front of me, its outstretched hand as still as stone. The book in my hands felt impossibly heavy now, as if it carried not just my story, but the stories of everyone trapped here. "I'll stay," I whispered, my voice trembling. The moment the words left my mouth, the fog surged forward, wrapping around me like icy tendrils. The towering figure tilted its head slightly, as if in approval. "You have chosen," it said, its voice deep and final. The figures surrounding me stepped closer, their translucent forms becoming sharper, more defined. Faces I hadn't been able to see before came into focus, faces full of sorrow, regret, and something else, relief. The book in my hands began to glow, its pages flipping wildly on their own. Names and stories filled the blank pages, faster than I could comprehend, as though the book was absorbing everything about me. My memories, my thoughts, my very essence. I wanted to scream, to hold on to something, but I felt myself unraveling. "Wait," I gasped, my voice barely audible. "What happens now?" The towering figure stepped closer, its hollow face inches from mine. "You become what you were meant to be," it said. The book snapped shut in my hands, the force of it sending a shockwave through the air. The glowing stopped, and the fog seemed to still, holding its breath. And then I felt it, a shift, deep inside me, like a thread being pulled loose. My memories began to slip away, not all at once, but piece by piece. My sister's laugh, my mother's voice, the warmth of the sun on my face, all of it faded into a cold gray void. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Please don't take them." But the fog didn't listen. I collapsed to my knees, the book falling from my hands and landing on the cobblestones with a dull thud. The figures around me moved closer, their forms becoming clearer, their faces more human. And then I understood. I was taking their place. By choosing to stay, I had freed them, allowed them to move on. The first figure, a young man with hollow eyes and a weary expression, stepped forward. He looked at me with something like gratitude, his form shimmering before fading into the mist. One by one, the others followed, each disappearing as the fog swallowed them whole. The village grew quieter with each departure until it was just me and the towering figure. "You are the guide now," it said, its voice softer but no less commanding. "You will help the lost find their way." I tried to speak, to ask what that meant, but the words wouldn't come. My voice was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that echoed inside me. The fog began to move again, swirling around me, and when I looked down, I saw my hands, blurry, indistinct, as though they were no longer entirely mine. I stood, unsteady on legs that felt foreign, and looked around the village. The buildings were still, the streets silent, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Through the fog, a shape emerged. Someone new, their face full of confusion and fear. A woman, clutching a flashlight, calling out for help. For a moment, I felt something stir inside me. Something faint and distant, pity maybe, or sorrow. I stepped toward her, my movements slow and deliberate, my form flickering in the mist. She saw me and froze, her eyes wide with terror. "Who are you?" she whispered. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. Only the sound of the fog swirling around us as the cycle began again. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd take a job restoring an old mansion perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, I probably would have laughed in their face. But here I was, staring up at Devereux Manor, a hulking, weathered beast of a house, its windows glaring down at me like eyes full of secrets. The place was massive, built from stone that had long since turned gray and mossy, with gnarled vines twisting their way up the walls. The Pacific wind whipped around the cliffs, carrying the faint taste of salt and something else, something old, like the house itself. The locals had a nickname for it, the Prison of Whispers. I'd heard their warnings before I even arrived in this tiny coastal town. They told me stories about strange sounds and people who'd stayed too long, only to leave broken, or not leave at all. But I figured they were just old ghost tales meant to keep kids from trespassing. Ghosts don't pay bills, I muttered to myself as I grabbed my bag and slammed the car door shut. I was here for work. Restoring historic properties was my specialty, and this was a big one. If I could bring this place back to life, it'd be a major win for my portfolio. When I stepped inside, I was hit by a wall of stale air, the kind that clung to your clothes and got stuck in your throat. The grand foyer stretched out before me, its high ceilings crowned with cracked moldings. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung thick like curtains. A massive chandelier dangled precariously above, its crystals dulled by decades of neglect. The house was quiet, too quiet. As I walked deeper into the foyer, my boots scuffed against the warped floorboards, the sound echoing faintly. The air seemed heavier here, the kind of heavy that makes your chest tighten for no good reason. I chalked it up to the atmosphere. This was an old house after all. They always felt a little creepy at first. By the time I'd made it to the parlor, the light outside was starting to dim, and long shadows crept across the walls. I set my bag down on an old dust-covered sofa and took a moment to catch my breath. That's when I heard it. It was soft, almost imperceptible, a faint whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I froze, straining to listen, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. "It's just the wind," I said aloud, my voice echoing in the empty room. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck refused to settle. Shaking it off, I pulled out my notepad and started jotting down a list of things that needed fixing. The windows were practically useless, letting in the cold ocean breeze. The roof was caving in on the east wing. And don't even get me started on the plumbing, if it even still worked. I moved to the far end of the parlor, where a tall bookshelf stood against the wall, its shelves sagging under the weight of dusty tomes. One book in particular caught my eye, its spine darker than the others. I reached for it, pulling it free with a small cloud of dust. As I opened it, something slid out from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. It was a photograph. I bent down to pick it up, holding it to the dim light filtering in through the cracked windows. The image was old, black and white, and it showed a woman standing in front of the house. She looked stern, with sharp features and a long dress that brushed the ground. But it wasn't the woman that made my stomach flip. It was the writing on the back of the photo, scrawled in a rushed, uneven hand. "They're in the walls. Don't let them take you." I stared at the words, my heart pounding. Suddenly, the quiet of the house felt oppressive, like the silence itself was watching me. The whisper came again, louder this time. I whipped around, searching the room, but it was empty. My bag sat untouched on the sofa, and the only thing moving was the lace curtain over the broken window, swaying gently in the breeze. "Megan?" The voice sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It sounded far away but close at the same time, like it was wrapping around me. I clutched the photo, my fingers trembling. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Just my imagination. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was in the house with me. I couldn't sleep that night. The photo, the whispers, the strange feeling that the house was somehow alive. It all kept looping in my mind. I stayed in one of the upstairs bedrooms, the least decrepit one I could find. But even with the door locked and the covers pulled tight, I couldn't shake the sense that something was just on the other side of the walls. By morning, I convinced myself it had been nothing more than exhaustion. Old houses creak, and my imagination had filled in the rest. That's what I told myself anyway. Still, as I sipped my lukewarm coffee in the kitchen, the photograph burned a hole in my pocket, and the words on the back echoed in my head. "They're in the walls. Don't let them take you." I had to figure out who the woman in the picture was. Maybe it would give me a logical explanation for all this. The house had a small study tucked away in the west wing, and I figured it was as good a place as any to start digging. The room was musty, with rows of leather-bound books that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. A large oak desk sat in the center, its surface cluttered with yellowed papers and an old ink blotter. I started sifting through the mess, hoping to find something, anything that could tell me more about Devereaux Manor or the people who'd lived here. That's when I found it. A journal. The leather cover was cracked with age and the pages were brittle, but the handwriting inside was surprisingly clear. It belonged to Eleanor Devereaux, the same name scrawled on the back of the photo. The first few entries were mundane enough, descriptions of the house, mentions of guests and parties, but as I read on, the tone shifted. Eleanor began to write about the whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, one entry read, but now I hear them even when the air is still. They speak my name, always my name, and sometimes I think they move behind the walls. I shivered, my eyes darting to the dark corners of the study. The walls were thick with peeling wallpaper, but I couldn't help imagining what might be on the other side. Eleanor's entries grew more frantic. She wrote about dreams of shadowy figures, about waking up to the sound of scratching inside the walls. Then, toward the end of the journal, her handwriting became jagged, almost illegible. "The house is alive," she wrote. "It feeds on us. I can feel it pulling me in, piece by piece. If anyone reads this, please, leave before it takes you too." I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. This was insane. Houses didn't feed on people, and yet the longer I stayed in Devereaux Manor, the harder it was to deny that something was wrong. As if on cue, the whisper started again. "Megan?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was louder now, clearer, and it was coming from directly behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. Then I noticed the wall. It was subtle, but I could see it, just a faint bulge like the wall was breathing. My heart pounded as I reached out, my fingers brushing against the peeling wallpaper. The surface was cold, almost wet, and as I pressed my hand against it, I felt something shift beneath my palm. That's when the banging started. It was loud, violent, like someone, or something, was trapped inside the wall, trying to get out. I stumbled back, my chair toppling over as the sound grew louder and louder, until it seemed like the whole house was shaking. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening, and I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. I knew I should leave, just grab my things and get the hell out of this place. But something inside me couldn't. I had to know what was going on here. I spent the rest of the day scouring the house, searching for more clues about Eleanor and the strange events she described in her journal. I found old newspaper clippings stuffed in a drawer in the master bedroom. One of them was a report on her disappearance. Eleanor Devereaux, last seen at her family estate on July 12, 1924, has been declared missing. The article read, "Despite extensive searches, no trace of her has been found." Another clipping mentioned other disappearances linked to the house, servants, guests, even children, all vanishing without a trace over the decades. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the journal, the photo, and the clippings. Eleanor wasn't just a name on an old piece of paper anymore. She was real. She'd lived in this house, heard the whispers, and vanished. And now, the house was calling my name. I don't remember falling asleep. One moment I was staring at Eleanor's journal, replaying every frantic word in my mind, and the next, I was jolted awake by a sound so loud it felt like the walls were splitting apart. It was the banging again, but this time it wasn't just in one spot. It was everywhere. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling seemed to come alive, trembling under the weight of something unseen. My heart raced as I sat up, clutching the journal like it was some kind of shield. "Megan?" The whisper came again, but now it was layered, multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping in a way that made my skin crawl. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were pleading, "Help us." I stumbled out of bed, the floorboards groaning beneath my feet as I moved toward the door. The whispers grew louder, their tone shifting from desperate to accusatory. "You can't run. You're part of this." My head spun. I didn't know what they meant, but I couldn't ignore the overwhelming urge to move, to find the source of the voices and end this nightmare. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and made my way down the dark hallway, the beam of light trembling with my shaky hands. The house seemed different now, warmer, almost pulsing, like it was alive and breathing. The air felt thick, heavy, and every creak of the floorboards under my feet echoed like a gunshot. The whispers led me to the parlor. As I stepped inside, the banging stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against my ears. The flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. And that's when I saw it. The wall by the old bookshelf. It was bulging again, the wallpaper straining against whatever was beneath it. But this time there was more. The surface writhed, the faint outline of hands and faces pressing outward as if the wall itself was trying to give birth to something. My breath caught in my throat as one of the faces turned toward me. It was Eleanor. "Megan," she said, her voice distorted and echoing. "You have to end this." I froze, the flashlight trembling in my grip. "What is this? What's happening to this house?" Her face pressed harder against the wall, her features contorted with pain. "It's a trap," she said, "built to hold us, to feed on us." "What do you mean?" My voice cracked. Before she could answer, the wall split open with a deafening crack, and the room was swallowed by darkness. I screamed as the flashlight flickered out, plunging me into an abyss. The air around me seemed to shift, growing colder and thicker, and I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. When the light sputtered back to life, I wasn't in the parlor anymore. I stood in a narrow corridor lined with walls of stone, the air damp and heavy. The whispers were everywhere now, rising and falling like a ghostly tide. At the far end of the corridor, a faint light glowed, pulsing like a heartbeat. I didn't want to go toward it, but I couldn't stop myself. My legs moved on their own, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. The light grew brighter as I approached, and soon I found myself standing in front of an enormous door made of iron and etched with strange, jagged symbols. The whispers converged here, their voices overlapping into a cacophony that made my head throb. Without thinking, I pushed the door open. Inside was a circular chamber, its walls covered in the same symbols as the door. At the center stood a massive, grotesque machine made of gears, pipes, and pulsing veins of light. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a fusion of machinery and something disturbingly organic. And then I saw him. A man stood beside the machine, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow. He wore a tattered suit, his posture rigid like a marionette held up by invisible strings. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice like gravel grinding against metal. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What is this place?" He turned to face me fully, and my stomach twisted. His features were familiar, too familiar. He looked like the man from the old photographs I'd found in the study, the architect. "This house is my masterpiece," he said, his tone almost reverent. "A vessel for eternal energy. Every soul it claims feeds the machine, keeping it alive, keeping me alive." "You built this?" I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. "I perfected it," he said, stepping closer, "and now you are part of it." The whispers swirled around me, growing louder, angrier. My mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was no escape. The door behind me had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of stone. The architect raised a hand, and the machine roared to life, its gears grinding and the veins of light pulsing faster. The walls trembled, and the floor beneath me began to crack. "You can't fight it," he said, his voice cold and final. "The house owns you now." But then I saw it, a lever on the side of the machine glowing faintly. It was small, almost hidden among the chaos of gears and pipes, but it called to me. Without thinking, I lunged for it. The architect screamed, his voice blending with the howls of the house itself, but I didn't stop. My fingers wrapped around the lever, and I pulled with all my strength. The machine let out a deafening roar, and the light inside it exploded outward, consuming everything in its path. The last thing I heard was Eleanor's voice, soft and relieved. "Thank you." When I woke up, everything was quiet. Too quiet. I was lying on the cold stone floor of the chamber, my body aching like I'd been dropped from a great height. The machine, the grotesque, pulsing monstrosity that had fed on so many souls, was dark now. Its gears were frozen, its veins of light extinguished. I pulled myself to my feet, every movement slow and deliberate. The chamber seemed smaller somehow, the walls pressing in as cracks spiderwebbed across their surface. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and something else, something acrid and decayed. For a moment I thought it was over. The machine was dead, the architect gone. I'd destroyed the heart of the house. But then I heard it, faint at first like a distant echo, the whispers. My breath caught in my throat. The voices were softer now, less frantic, but they hadn't disappeared. They were still here, lingering in the cracks of the walls, in the air itself. The ground beneath me trembled, and I knew I didn't have much time. The house was collapsing, crumbling in on itself like a dying beast. I stumbled toward where the door had been, hoping it would reappear, but instead the stone shifted, opening into another dark corridor. I didn't have a choice. I ran. The hallway twisted and turned, the walls shuddering with every step I took. Dust and debris rained down from above, and the whispers followed me, growing louder with each passing moment. "You can't leave!" "It's not over. Stay with us." The whispers weren't just voices anymore. They were tangible, brushing against my skin like cold, ghostly fingers. I fought the rising panic in my chest, focusing on the faint light at the end of the corridor. When I finally burst through the door at the end, I found myself back in the parlor. The house was tearing itself apart. The chandelier above swayed dangerously, its crystals clinking together like a mournful melody. The walls cracked and groaned, and the floor beneath me felt unstable, like it could give way at any moment. I grabbed my bag from the sofa, not bothering to check if anything had fallen out. There was no time. The front door was just ahead, hanging crooked on its hinges, and beyond it, I could see the faint glow of dawn. I sprinted for it, dodging falling debris as the house screamed around me. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic roar that filled my head. "Megan, don't leave!" "Stay! Join us!" I hit the door with my shoulder, forcing it open, and stumbled out onto the overgrown lawn. The cold morning air hit me like a slap, and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. Behind me, Devereaux Manor groaned one final time before the entire structure collapsed in on itself, sending up a plume of dust and debris. I watched, dazed and trembling, as the once mighty house was reduced to little more than a pile of rubble. It was over. At least that's what I thought. As I sat there, staring at the ruins, the whispers began again. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Megan?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers were coming from behind me now, not from the house. Slowly, I turned my head. On the ground next to me, half buried in the dirt, was a single shard of glass. It was blackened and jagged, and when I picked it up, my reflection stared back at me. But it wasn't just me. Behind my reflection, faint and flickering, I could see Eleanor. Her face was calm now, but her eyes held a warning. "You stopped the machine," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "But the house isn't gone. It will find another way." The shard grew colder in my hand, and the whispers swirled around me once more, no longer pleading but promising. "Another way. Another door. Another Megan." I dropped the shard, my hands trembling, and backed away from the ruins. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the wreckage as the whispers faded into the wind. Eventually, I got up, grabbed my bag, and walked away, leaving Devereaux Manor behind. But the whispers stayed with me. Even now, back in Portland, I hear them sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet, they creep into my thoughts, reminding me that the house is still out there, waiting for its next victim. And I can't help but wonder, did I escape or did I just become part of it?